welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to another chapter of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jen, one of your co-hosts, and today I'm here with an extraordinarily prolific and amazing writer whose work I really can't wait to dig into. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, Jen. My name's Gill Paul, and I'm an author of historical fiction. And this is my 11th historical novel, The Manhattan Girls, which is set in Prohibition-era New York. It's about 4 women who started a bridge club in 1921. And these women were Dorothy Parker, the famous wit, who I'm sure needs no introduction at all. Jane Grant, who was the first woman reporter at the New York Times and trying to start her own magazine at the time. There's Winifred Lenihan, a Broadway actress who starred in the premiere of George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan. And also Peggy Leach, who worked at Condé Nast magazines at the time and was writing her first novels by night. So these 4 incredible women came together, started a bridge group. And my novel is the story of the group and their relationships and their efforts to try and keep Dorothy, or Dottie as I call her, to keep her from harming herself.
Yeah, I really loved this book. I thought it was so much fun, and it was really, really wonderful to get to know all of these women. And I was just, constantly marveling at the number of luminaries that they just like brush up against in their everyday lives. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what drew you to this social circle in particular, and what made you want to explore their lives on the page.
Well, I think all the characters that I write about, and I do tend to write novels with real historical characters in them. My last 10 novels, I think some real historical characters have wandered in at some point, and then in a few of them, they're the main event. But I was just fascinated by Dorothy Parker from, I think, my teenage years. Just this combination. I mean, it's a classic, really, the kind of depressed clown. Her wit is so sharp and modern and still incredibly funny today when you look at some of her lines. You know, for example, she said, if you want to know what God thought about money, just look at the people he gave it to. And that applies to so many people today. I'm not going to name names, obviously. And just everything she came out with is so sharp, really clever wordplay. And yet she has this incredibly difficult psychology. She was very insecure in her relationships. She had a very broken up childhood with her mother, who died when she was 5. Then her stepmother died, then her uncle died, then her father died, then one of her brothers disappeared. So really a huge, a psychiatrist would have a field day with the abandonment in her life. And a lot of people with fractured backgrounds like that are drawn to comedy in a perverse kind of way. It doesn't cure them, but that was something that I was interested in exploring, how that worked in her particular case. And of course, she was hanging out at the Algonquin Round Table, which was a very male-dominated atmosphere, it seems to me. These famous male journalists and critics and columnists. And she held her own amongst them all, and that was interesting too. But I love the 1920s, whether it's in Paris, London, or New York, because women were finding so many new freedoms that they hadn't had before the war. They could have fulfilling careers. They could rent their own apartments. They could drive cars. If they were married, they could get birth control from the Margaret Sanger clinic. There were all sorts of things that they could suddenly do. So, and that made it possible for some of them to have love lives, to take lovers in the way that men traditionally had. But it's not always easy to cope with that as a woman, to have different lovers. And that was another thing that Dottie was up against, the emotional toll that can take. So there were just, honestly, Jenna, a million things I wanted to write about in this book. It's a subject that it had been on my list for a while, but I was nervous about it because really, who do I think I am, writing dialogue for the wittiest woman in the world? That's something I had to really consider. And I discussed it a lot with my editor. But I decided I'm writing about her in real life, not every single line that she came out with in her life was hysterically funny. She said, "Pass the salt," like everybody else. Can you hold that door for me? So I thought, no, I don't have to make every line funny. I can use some, funny lines. I think she probably, looking at some of her lines, I think she rehearsed them and waited for the right time to slip them into conversation. So yeah, I found a way to write her thoughts and feelings, and it's also told from the points of views of the other three women as well. Chapter about, so it's Jane, Dottie, Winifred, Peggy. You hear from their points of view, and that's how I structured it. Yeah.
I was, particularly impressed by the way that you captured Dorothy's voice. And, it occurs to me while you were speaking that in some ways that task seems like it would be, in some ways, a really easy and fun one because she had such a distinctive voice and she is very, like when you read her words, you can tell it's her. But on the other hand, that also makes it incredibly difficult because what a level, like what a bar to clear, like she was just so funny and so sparkling so much of the time. And then to have to really capture that is just like a tremendous task. And I think you do a really good job of, capturing how performative it was, and that's why she doesn't really have to talk that way all the time because it is like an act that she's putting on for the world in some ways,
Yeah. And a lot of wordplay in it. She loved words. She loved to just twist the meaning of a word. There's that famous quote. She was asked to define the word horticulture or to use the word horticulture in a sentence. She said, "You can take a horticulture, but you can't make her think." And, how quickly did she come up with that? We don't know. I'd like to think it was this spur of the moment, but she just loved words. So when you're trying to come up with a funny Dottie line, you just have to take words and twist them a little bit. That's what I tried to do.
Yeah, it's really great. It's fun to, read her voice and then also to sort of, as you say, see what's going on under the surface. Because as we just spoke about, like she had this sparkling wit and she presented this really carefree and breezy cosmopolitan girl face to the world, but she was dealing with a lot of mental health struggles and a lot of interpersonal problems. And, it was interesting to see how her friends sort of come together to support her and try to get past that that defensive shield, because the humor is in a way like a defense mechanism. Like, did you see it that way too? Or
yeah, very much so. And that's why I wanted her women friends in there. I think they would have been more supportive possibly than the men round the Algonquin Round Table would have been. Although having said that, Bob Benchley was just about her closest friend in that period. But I just wanted to write about these women because I thought each of them had a particular story. Of course, they must have wanted to shake Dottie at times because she was her own worst enemy. She was chaotic. She drank too much. She didn't pay her bills and she rushed out and bought herself a new hat when she couldn't afford it. And she just chose the worst possible men to have affairs with, the ones that were definitely never going to commit to her and probably going to trample all over her feelings as well. And I don't know about you, Jen, but I do have friends like that. And the kind that need rescuing. And they're very lovable. And sometimes you just want to take them by the shoulders and say, "Come on,"
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we all have those friends. And then, every once in a while, we all are that friend too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh, yes, I've been there.
Let's talk a little bit about her friends, because I think it was really striking that all these women, Dorothy, Jane, Peggy, and Winifred, are all, as you were saying, they're all existing at this moment where there are so many new opportunities for women and for them to expand their lives and to step into new occupations and roles. But they are also up against a lot of, like the old guard, the men who don't want to, share any any of the power or the prestige, and they're still dealing with men who don't take them seriously. And I think you show a lot of really interesting ways in which women have to learn to navigate those boundaries and those discriminations, you know?
Of course, yeah. Yeah, I was thinking that comes across quite strongly in Jane Grant's story. She was the first woman, a reporter on the city desk at the New York Times, but the men there insisted on calling her Fluff and playing tricks on her, sending her out on fake stories and, leaving strange things on her desk. And she put up with it. She really did. Later in life, she was asked if she saw herself as a feminist, and she said she supposed she had been without ever making a conscious decision. But in fact, she had joined the Lucy Stone League. She was a co-founder of this league to campaign for women not to have to take, married women not to have to take their husbands' names. And she always called herself Jane Grant, although she was married to Harold Ross. She campaigned in 1924. She started a society to help other women get into newspapers, to get careers in journalism. So she really was quite incredible. But she and Harold took over this great big house in Hell's Kitchen. She was the one that did all the work. He was living there. Alec Walcott was living there. Jane bought the food. She arranged the cleaning. She arranged everything. So, there's feminism, but she was just starting at the beginning of being a feminist. And the men were still walking all over her to an extent, although I have to say, I don't think I would have taken her on. She was quite indomitable, really. So yeah, you see that very strongly in Jane's career. With Winifred, she started out as an actress. Now, of the four of them, she's the one that was the most hard to research because there's very little about her. There's a Wikipedia page, there's reviews on IMDb of theatre plays that she was in. There's a film that she was in 1949, which I've watched. And so it gave me a bit more leeway as a novelist to shape her story to make it complement the others. But certainly, I knew from the facts that after her incredible achievement in George Bernard Shaw's premiere of St. Joan, she backed away from acting. And I talked to a few actress friends about this. We looked through the facts of her life and what she did. And she stepped back. She wanted more control. She didn't want to be the person standing on the stage while a male director told her to unfasten a couple of buttons in her blouse or whatever. She wanted to be in charge a bit more. And that's what she moved into, directing her own shows and in the 1930s making radio plays. So, yeah, I think her career from the surface facts seems to be about taking more control as well, which was, very hard for the era. And she must have been I've portrayed her as quite a gentle character, but I think she must have been quite able to stand up for herself as well.
Yeah, I think with a lot of these women, you see a really interesting mix of strength and resilience, but also vulnerability, and like a little bit of fragility. There's this really interesting balance there. And it, I think that kind of like both were probably necessary to survive in this world, And I really just love that the way that their friendship is this constant presence in their lives over the years, even though they sort of like recede from each other's lives and then come back or have little disagreements and get over them. And they are able to do this despite the fact that like they have a lot of different like viewpoints, they have a lot of different beliefs, and they are just like really a lot of like very independent thinking women who have a really interesting connection,
Yeah, I mean, I really just found that sentence about the Bridge Club group that they started in Marion Mead's fantastic biography of Dorothy Parker, What Fresh Hell Is This? And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then it cropped up again when I was reading Jane's memoir of her times, her marriage and starting the New Yorker with her husband. So I've invented most of the Bridge group. I don't know how long it lasted, but this is the great thing about being a novelist. we can take liberties. I always, when I do make up bits and pieces from real people's lives, I always have a historical afterword at the end where I confess, because I'm not in the business of trying to falsify history. But that was interesting in this, some, obviously with Dorothy, there are lots of biographies and there's lots of documented fact about her. With Winifred, just about nothing. With Peggy Leach, Margaret Leach, the best source that I found for learning about her was that she wrote 3 novels in the 1920s, in the period that I'm writing about. And I managed to get hold of copies of all of them. And you can really tell that she's a very intuitive person who watches other people very carefully, and watches other people's relationships. And I enjoyed the novels, actually. They're dated, they're of their time. But yeah, that's how I came up with my portrait of her character. I think she was another very strong one, definitely.
Yeah, she was so much fun, and she was so interesting. And I really liked the way that she spoke her mind and was really not afraid to disagree with people or to express displeasure at a statement. And I really admire that, because I think especially in that era, but still today, like, women are often sort of culturally instructed not to do that, right? Like, to keep the peace and to keep your opinions to yourself. And so it was just really fun to see a woman in this time period who was just like really not afraid just to see what she thinks. And she had a lot of really interesting thoughts. Like, one of my favorite lines in the whole book was something that Peggy said, when she said that religion is man's compromise with a hostile environment. I was like, gosh, that's such a good line. Like, and it just like sums up her outlook so well.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm glad you like that. Good. Yeah. I mean, I wanted her to be the intellectual one of the bunch. She's a big reader and big thinker, but yeah, we had to let her have some fun as well in the book. So, and it's true that she did have an affair with this psychotherapist. That was another fact that I stumbled across. So, which was very brave in those days when it was hard. It was still hard to get contraception. It was, if women wanted to get married, then still it was probably better if they were virgins, and a lot of men wouldn't look at them if they weren't. So yeah, it was a very, very difficult time still to be a woman.
Absolutely. And it was an interesting time for the country too, because this was during the Prohibition era, and Prohibition is really kind of like central to their lives, like in a lot of ways. Like, they are kind of immersed in like a sort of like intellectual drinking culture, like especially at the Algonquin, where they are just constantly drinking and engaging in this wordplay and just sort of like all, performing their intelligence for each other. Yeah, was there something in particular that also like drew you to that time period as well, or?
Well, I've always been fascinated by Prohibition and the way that, particularly in New York, which is famous for having a lot of very kind of liberal-minded people there and independent, and they go their own way. So the minute the government said, no, you shall not drink, New Yorkers became absolutely ingenious in finding ways to get alcohol, all over the place. Cordial stores, you just go in and they've got cordial on display, and they've got the booze under the counter. And taxi drivers would peel back a rug in the footwell and say, hey ladies, can I give you something to drink at your party or wherever you're going? And yeah, but of course it created this whole gangster culture as well. It created a lot of millionaires out of them. So and arrests for drunkenness actually went up, public drunkenness, after, in the years after Prohibition, which was kind of against the point that the Temperance League were trying to achieve. So yes, it was a strange experiment, which has still had a lasting effect on American culture. I think when I went to school in the States for a year, and we were in West Virginia, which was a dry state, and my parents used to drive across the border to buy alcohol. So I remember that. I don't know if it still is, but yes, I could say that was still lasting at the time.
Yeah, and I know there are still dry counties to this day. There are, but and it's interesting how that sort of prohibition or making something illegal or inaccessible immediately makes it more attractive, and it also like supports an entire like shadow economy of people who will get you those things. That leads me to another thing that I loved about this, which is all the cameos from luminaries and some not so luminaries of the era. So as we were just saying, like there are a lot of appearances here from famous gangsters in this era, especially those who sort of like made their name off the back of Prohibition and like, acquiring these things that you could no longer really get easily. So can you talk a little bit about them? Like, because we see Arnold Rothstein, we see Lucky Luciano, we see Meyer Lansky, just like so many interesting figures.
So I'm seeing in the novel, I'm seeing them from the point of view of, well, it's mainly Jane and Winifred. And so there's only a limited amount that we can talk about. But yeah, these guys must have been really scary. There's no two ways about it. Rothstein was the one that was said to have fixed the 1919 World Series. And I know they were all very involved in fixing horse races and narcotics, all kinds of gangster activity that was growing, and then of course exploded when Prohibition was overturned. Then they had to find new ways to earn a living, and there was a lot of warfare, and none of them survived, I think, into the mid-19th, and none of them survived a decade beyond when I'm writing about them. It's a dangerous career. But yeah, it's very difficult with when you're doing research on a book like this. You're going to have some cameos, but who do you leave out? I mean, Dorothy knew Hemingway. In fact, he was quite mean about her. Do I leave? I left that all out. It just didn't fit my story arc. This is the really hard thing. You have to take, when you're writing about real historical characters, you can take the facts, but you need to make it fit. To make it a novel, you need to make it fit into this narrative arc with something that drives it forwards, that the readers want to find out, and a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you can't just take a little story like Ernest Hemingway being incredibly rude about Dorothy Parker at a party and shoehorn it into the novel, because it just didn't fit, which is annoying. I'll have to write another novel to get that bit in.
That's really interesting to me, because before I worked in libraries, I trained as a historian, and I have absolutely felt that urge too when writing my dissertation back in the day. Like every interesting anecdote that you kind of happen upon was sort of like is so hard won, and so and just like pulled from sources that you just want to include it all. And that process of figuring out what to include and what not to include can be really heartbreaking.
But Jen, you were working in medieval history, weren't you?
Yes,
there's so much less known. I mean, I find that fascinating about medieval. And then all of a sudden you come across a manuscript or some little piece that just gives you such insight into their lives. But yeah, I can see that you would want to include everything because there's just so much less to know, isn't there?
Oh yeah, for sure. And especially when you're translating and when you are happening upon sources that people haven't really looked at in a while, you're like, well, I worked really hard to get to this thing, so it feels like I should include it. But that is also where like feature research and where feature books come from, so that can be really important too. What kind of sources did you look at? Like you mentioned Peggy's novels, and I'm wondering, like, were there newspapers or archives or things like that you consulted?
There's video footage. The Dorothy Parker Society website has recordings of Dorothy reading her own work, which is wonderful. There are movies, all kinds of things. There are some great documentaries. Ken Burns did an amazing documentary on Prohibition. I just love everything he does, more or less.
That was a great one. His Prohibition one was very good.
Yeah, I think they're all good. I just catch everyone as they come out. So yeah, I mean, I always start off when I'm writing about real historical characters, I start off with the main biographies, always remembering, as a historian, and I trained in history at university as well, you need to look at the agenda that each biographer has going into it. And particularly with some of the women, not so much Dorothy, but some of the women I've written about in the past, like Wallis Simpson, who married the King, Edward VIII of England abdicated his throne for her. I think there was a real misogyny in some of her biographies. That was, how could a man possibly love her so much that he would give up a throne for her when, she was quite plain looking. And there was a lot of, I think she got a really bad press. And so it's kind of digging between the lines of what the biographers are saying and why they're saying it, and trying to come up with your own view of what this person was like. And that's part of the job. So I'll read through the biographies, trying to think about which bits ring true for me, what I'm looking for. I'm trying to get my own kind of emotional empathy with these women, think about how would I feel about them if they walked into the room right now and sat down and joined in our conversation, which, goodness, I wish Dorothy would. It'd be great. What would they say for themselves? And always, I've never written about anybody I didn't like. So as a main character, I might have a few side characters. But yeah, trying to find what it is I like about them. And when I find that they had a lot of friends, you think, okay, this is good. I can work with this. Why did their friends like them? And take it from there. But yeah, there's a lot of digging. But obviously, unlike you writing your PhD in medieval history, I've got a lot more leeway, because if I can't find a fact somewhere, I can just make it up. I can just make things up.
And I really love that you just mentioned your process, because one of the other things that I loved about this book so much is that it feels, even though we have like a third person omniscient narrator here, speaking through the perspectives of these different women, it's a very intimate narrator voice, I feel like. And when I was reading it, like, I felt like I was kind of sitting next to the narrator at one of these parties, who was like pointing out all the different people in the room to me, and cluing me in onto what was going on. And it just like really makes you feel like you're there. It's very immediate, and it makes you want to be there.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's great to hear. So it's close third person narration through each of the four women's points of view chapter about. So when you've got close third person, it means the reader can only see through that character's eyes, can only see and know what that character knows. But that's why I like to have, I've got four narrators in this, so that it gives you more of a range. Because if it was just Dorothy telling her own story, it would be a bit, I don't quite know if I would trust it anyway. She did invent things a lot about herself and other people, and not entirely trustworthy as a narrator, especially when she was drunk, which she was a lot of the time.
Yeah, that was that seems like a big challenge, I think, to their lifestyle in general. It's just the amount of drinking that you sort of had to do to be in the social circle, and to and I remember you do have one character who is sober at the beginning of joining the circle, and then by as that time goes on, he becomes a drinker too, and is kind of pulled into the lifestyle.
Yeah, that's Bob Benchley. And he had an orange blossom in a club one day, having been teetotaler before, and he went on to become an alcoholic and died of cirrhosis of the liver in the 1940s. So yeah, that didn't work so well for him. I mean, the other thing is that they're all young when I'm writing about them. They're in their late 20s, just crossing the boundary into the 30s. And I could get away with a lot more partying at that age than I do now. So you've got a lot more stamina for late nights, and I wouldn't try it now.
Absolutely not. Yeah, it does seem, it seems fun for a very particular part of your life. So one of the other things that I wanted to talk about was another cameo that we had mentioned earlier a little bit, but I wanted to talk about Winifred and George Bernard Shaw, because one of my favorite plot lines, especially as a medievalist, was the rehearsals for and the premiere of his Joan of Arc play. And reading about the rehearsal process and then the performance, and then just really made me want to see that production in particular. There's like a certain,
me too. I wish they'd recorded it.
Yes, it's like a really unique sort of like morning that you do for live theater performances that you can't, you can't possibly see. And I've definitely felt that reading this.
I think she was clearly from reading the reviews, I think she was clearly a very transformative actress, that she stepped into the role and lost herself in it and could hear the, God speaking voices in her head. It seems to have been quite shattering. I mean, universally, all the top theatre critics on Broadway were saying it was a career-making performance, and you must see this show, which is great for George Bernard Shaw as well, because his career had been in a slight slump just before that. So it worked well for both of them. But I'm not sure Winifred was entirely happy with the level of fame, because after that she stopped taking leading roles. So there was something that happened in the course of that made her not want to carry on with that level of fame. And she was only 25 at the time. She could easily have done a lot more leading lady work. But yeah, magazines wanting to interview her about what shade of lipstick she wore and where she bought her clothes was just, in my version anyway, it wasn't her kind of idea. She was a serious actress and she wanted to be taken seriously for her craft.
Absolutely. And, reading that, like some of that was, it was very insightful into the sort of, ways in which women had to struggle against stereotyping and being underestimated when going into these careers. But it also kind of dismayed me because that stuff still happens, like when actors are on the red carpet, the men get asked about like the acting choices they made and their careers. And then the women get asked like, who are you wearing? Like.
I know. But the difference is nowadays that actresses are calling it out. Scarlett Johansson calls it out and says, hey, why are you asking me about my clothes? And that's just what we as women have to keep doing as long as it keeps on happening, which has probably got a while to go yet.
Yeah, but it was really nice to know that, almost 100 years ago now that these women were sort of already paving the way and sort of like showing the way for future generations.
Really? I mean, it doesn't feel like 100 years. It feels so modern, what they were, the problems they were facing and the way that they confronted them. And that's what I loved about it. It's, they just, when you think that just 20 years before that was kind of, they were wearing great big bustles and corsets and so forth. They'd made a giant leap there from their mother's generation, certainly.
Absolutely. And those time periods in which we're taking giant leaps, in which you get like massive transformations in society, are like just really rich, I think, for storytelling and especially exploring just like the differences in how different generations think, and like people coming up against social norms and all that stuff. It's just really exciting to watch people act during that period,
Absolutely. And I'm fascinated. I want to look a bit more into how it was slightly different in Paris, London, and New York. I think in Paris, they were much further ahead in terms of wearing makeup and scandalous clothes than the Americans were. And then London as well. I think Paris was leading the way, but then there were a lot of artists and intellectuals and left-wing people in town, and that maybe fed into it. There was Picasso, and I don't know. I haven't written a Paris novel yet, but I can feel it coming on. Sometimes lots of things just build up in your head and you think, oh, I need to do this.
Well, I would love to read that book. Yeah, Paris was very interesting in this time period because they were so ahead of the curve. And also in terms of just like, racial integration and acceptance of different cultures. And it's just like so ripe for storytelling. It's really great.
Yeah. Josephine Baker. I think there's just a new biography out of Josephine Baker and her work, not just for the resistance, but according to this, I just read last week, she was working for British intelligence during the war. She was just an extraordinary woman, just wonderful. But there have been a lot of books about her.
And I think Ruth Negga is going to be playing her in an upcoming film too.
Oh, really? Oh, that will be wonderful. That will be great.
Well, I wanted to thank you so much for coming to talk with us today. This has been a lot of fun, and I'm really glad that you made the time, to come and talk to our listeners.
Oh, it's entirely my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Oh, you're so welcome. Okay, listeners, you can check out the Manhattan Girls at your favorite library or independent bookstore. I highly recommend it. It's just like, I think I said in my Neck Alley review, like this, it just goes down like a champagne cocktail. It's just like it's a nice. All right. This has been Jen in conversation with Gill Paul, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.